Support for Ben Franklin's World and the Doing History series comes from the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture. As we've been exploring in the Doing History series, historians spend a lot of time conducting the research they need to write the history books and articles we love to read. One way the Omohundro Institute helps to support this painstaking work is with its fellowships. Presently, the OI offers 7 different types of fellowships to support scholars at all career levels. To find out more about how fellowships assist scholars with their work, I spoke with Mary Beth Norton, an award-winning historian at Cornell University and the author of 5 history books.
It's hard to say how long it took me to do the witchcraft book because I was thinking about it for many years before I actually started to do the research. I read all the secondary sources, of course, but the actual research for the book, once I decided to do it, took me about 5 years, which is very short for me. Liberty's Daughters took me 8 years. Founding Mothers and Fathers took me 16 years. My most recent book, Separated by Their Sex, took me about 5 or 6 years. Fellowships have been very important to me when I've been writing. In fact, I've written most of my books while I've been on fellowship. When you have a fellowship, you're free from teaching and from other kinds of university obligations. Oftentimes, you can leave your normal place of residence, go somewhere else, which means you can truly focus on your work. This is exactly the kind of work that Institute fellowships support. You can do research in fits and starts, but you can't write in fits and starts. The Omohundro is tremendously important in supporting early American scholarship.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 88 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. In episode 84, Zara Hanslin took us behind the scenes of how historians work by showing us how they interpret primary historical sources. But historians rely on secondary sources too. These sources tell us something about the past, but they were not used, created, or written by people who witnessed the person, place, or event the historian is studying. In this 6th episode of our Doing History, How Historians Work series, we will explore how historians read and interpret the secondary sources they rely on most, books and articles written by other historians. To help us investigate this aspect of how historians work, Michael McDonnell, an associate professor of history at the University of Sydney, will show us how he used the books and articles of other historians to write his latest book, Masters of Empire, Great Lakes Indians and the Making of America. During our behind-the-scenes tour, Mike reveals who the Anishinaabe peoples were and how they lived during the 17th and 18th centuries, why historians have relegated the Anishinaabe peoples to the edges of European and American history books, and what historians mean by historiography and how they use it to research and write new history books and articles. Are you ready to explore the Anishinaabe peoples and discover more about how historians use the work of other historians to do history? Let's go welcome our guest historian.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Our guest is a historian from Sydney, Australia, where he works as an associate professor at the University of Sydney. He has co-authored a book and authored 2, The Politics of War, Race, Class, and Conflict in Revolutionary Virginia, and, most recently, Masters of Empire, Great Lakes Indians and the Making of America. He joins us as part of our Doing History, How Historians Work series to lead us on an exploration of how historians use history books or secondary sources in their research. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Michael McDonnell.
Many thanks, Liz. It's a pleasure and an honor to be on the show.
Mike, your book, Masters of Empire, begins with the story of a very interesting individual, Charles Michel Mouet de Langlade. Would you tell us who he was and why you wanted to tell his story?
Yeah, it was a fascinating story. I knew a little bit about it. Thanks to the work of a historian named Paul Trapp up in Canada, we knew the bare outlines of his story. He was a Métis fur trader, ostensibly, from Mackinac or Michilimackinac up in northern Michigan. And really that meant he was born to an Ottawa woman who was his mother and French fur trader Augustin Langlade, his father. And as I said, we knew the bare outlines of his story, but it was an amazing story. You know, he was at most of the major battles of the latter half of the 18th century, at skirmish Pickawillany that probably set off or helped set off the 7 Years' War. He was supposed to be among the Indians who cut down General Braddock in 1755. He was at the so-called massacre of Fort William Henry in 1757 that was then, of course, later depicted by James Fenimore Cooper and then later Daniel Day-Lewis in The Last of the Mohicans. He was then at Battle of the Plains of Abraham, where he was supposedly among the sharpshooters who cut down General Wolfe. A little later, he was in Pontiac's War, and then, surprisingly, after fighting with the French and with the Indians for so many years, when the British took over the French claims in North America, Langlade seemed to join the British, and he was with Burgoyne in his famous expedition or infamous expedition up the Champlain Valley and his loss at Saratoga. And Langlade also fought against George Rogers Clark in the West and later was called on to raise Indian warriors against Anthony Wayne in the Northwest Indian War. And then, incredibly, I think, he's actually quite well known in Wisconsin, where he and his father are known as among the first permanent white settlers of the state. So it was a great story. Europeans thought he had a great influence over Indians, and I thought this could be a kind of an entree into an Indian world. But I also thought it was just a great story that might make for a great biography, a sort of a life and times biography of Langlade.
Wow. Langlade was in the right place at the right time for historians. I mean, as you mentioned, he witnessed and participated in many important events from the French and Indian War right through the very early days of the United States.
That's right. And often when I was working on trying to flesh out this biography, quite a few people said, it sounds like the Forrest Gump of the 18th century, sort of always there at the right time, right place, and almost seems inexplicable in some ways.
In addition to being in the right place at the right time for historians, Langlade was a man whose deeds were determined by the needs and desires of his Native American family. Mike, would you tell us about Langlade's Anishinaabeg family and how they contributed to his actions?
European officials who were in contact with Langlade often spoke of his influence over the Indians and placed a lot of confidence in him to be able to kind of act as a mediator, an intermediary for them with the native peoples that he seemed to be able to bring to the battleground on many different occasions. And so I wanted to, I had to dig into that Indian family a little bit and discover something about them. And I realized that influence, was a two-way street and maybe even possibly more of a kind of a native influence over Langlade. I realized, of course, that Langlade was very dependent on his Indian family for even basic things. Fur traders like Langlade and his father, it was a difficult environment to work in up in Mackinac and the Great Lakes. It's a precarious kind of environment. They needed food. They needed shelter. They needed provisions for kind of long hunting seasons or trapping seasons. And people like Langlade were really dependent on Indian hosts, depended on them, as I said, for food and shelter, but also access to trade, the kind of contacts, the networks that native peoples had already established for trade, and then marriage as well. We often think of French fur traders marrying into Indian families because it was useful to them, but I realized that Langlade's father had married into an Indian family because that Indian family thought it would be useful to have that fur trader in their midst. And I realized as well, in part, that influence was important to his Indian family because his uncle, so the brother of his mother, was, we think, an Ogima, or a chief, sachem sometimes they're called, but in the Great Lakes world it seems to be Ogima, was a fellow named Nissawacket. And he had a kind of a long lineage in the Great Lakes, and it's fairly clear that he was quite keen to extend his influence into the French world by getting his sisters, and particularly Domitilde, Langlade's mother, to marry a French trader. And in the Algonquian world of the Great Lakes, uncles were probably more important than fathers and had a much greater influence on their nephews and nieces, but particularly their nephews. And really, Langlade's influence was highly dependent on Nissawacket's influence among his people. And really, Langlade's ability in raising or influence in raising warriors at any one time was really dependent on how much influence his uncle held at any one time. And that influence then, in turn, depended on kinship ties. Kinship ties of his uncle and his extended Indian family that extended really for hundreds of miles across the Great Lakes. So Longlad was really only able to appear at those important events in North American history with Indian warriors, really because his Indian family facilitated those movements and also was able to use their influence to help Longlad bring those warriors to the battlefields.
Now that we know a bit about Longlade's Native American family, what do we know about the Anishinaabe peoples? Would you tell us about them and how they lived during the 17th and 18th centuries?
It's a difficult question. In some ways, it's a big question. It's like describing who the British were in the 17th or 18th century. It's a big kind of question, and they're very diverse peoples in many ways. But in a nutshell, I suppose, by 1600 or so, by the time Europeans arrived to stay, if you like, the Anishinaabe could be found all across the Great Lakes. All across the Great Lakes and the tributary rivers, really from about Montreal right out to the Mississippi River. And interestingly, it seems that they had moved west from the sort of the St. Lawrence Valley, Ottawa River Valley, out into the Great Lakes. And interestingly, they continued to expand really, I think, throughout the colonial period, right up until the beginning of the 19th century, even into the mid-19th century. But what was difficult to discover, and what I think historians have been slow to discover, was that they lived in really dispersed, smaller villages and settlements throughout the lakes. So you could find them in different places between Montreal and Mississippi, but really in dispersed places. So they didn't look like they were connected. They lived sort of many miles apart. And now this was, of course, I think, very much based on local resources and what could be found in particular places, and the fact that the environment was not that conducive to kind of larger settlements, and the growing seasons weren't long enough to sustain bigger settlements like you could find in the South. And they certainly weren't organized in a way that Europeans were used to seeing, both in Europe, but also even among the much more densely settled, really clustered villages of Huronia, or the Wyandot people, or the Iroquois settlements, the Haudenosaunee people. But historians have really been able to kind of connect up the dots, if you like, because we've realized that these villages were connected by kinship, by language, and by trade connections between them. For example, they all seem to speak Anishinaabe, which is a distinct subset of the Algonquian language. And we used to think that they were just all Algonquian peoples. But we've realized that there was a sort of a distinct subset of people. When Europeans came along, they tried to figure all of this out, and they called them the names that we're a little bit more familiar with today: the Mississauga, the Algonquin, the Nipissing, and particularly in the upper Great Lakes, the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, the Odawa or Ottawa. The Ojibwe, I think, are known in America more as the Chippewa. But historians have realized that all of these major groups spoke Anishinaabe. They were also connected by trade connections. They were also connected by kinship. And historians have uncovered a system of dodomag, or totems, if you like. Perhaps the older word is clans. So that someone in the Ottawa village of Mackinac might belong to the Bear clan, or dodomag, who had then relations as well with people along the French River or the Ottawa River, who Europeans called Nipissing, but also had members of the Bear clan in that community as well. So they were connected by these kind of totems, or dodomag, that the Anishinaabe called them. And, we don't have a lot of evidence, but one of the things that was really telling was that these particular groups never went to war with each other. One of them at one point told the British that we are all allies to each other and one people. And historians have realized that not all Algonquian people got on with each other and were at peace with each other. But by and large, these 5 nations that we know today never went to war with each other. So that was another sign that they were all connected in some ways. And given those connections, when you think about their geographic spread and the numbers of different villages and the numbers of people in those villages, it made for a really powerful Anishinaabe, a greater territory of the Anishinaabe, a really populous group, a really powerful group, it turns out, who we didn't know a lot about. As I said, we sort of had studied them separately, and we didn't know a great deal about them, but suddenly it became clear that they were a really powerful group that influenced the course of American history very immensely.
As you described the Anishinaabe peoples and their culture, I couldn't help but think that some aspects of their culture sounded very similar to Iroquois or Haudenosaunee culture. For example, the Haudenosaunee peoples of New York had a League of Nations that kept them at peace with one another, and they also had extensive kinship networks. It's very interesting that you have these two very different peoples that shared some cultural similarities with each other.
I mean, in some ways, the Anishinaabe were different because they didn't have the formal political kind of systems in place that the Haudenosaunee had. And Europeans initially, and then historians subsequently, have been a little bit confused or more confused about the Anishinaabe because they didn't seem to be quite like the Iroquois in their organization. They didn't organize themselves quite the same. But they were no less powerful than the Iroquois, and they provided a really important counterbalance to the Iroquois, especially in the 17th century when the Iroquois were flexing their muscles for many different reasons. It was really the Anishinaabe that provided a really powerful counterpart to the Iroquois, and the French knew that, or sensed that at least. And so they threw their lot in with the Anishinaabe, and for most of the 17th century, as I write about in the book, were really dependent on Anishinaabe help against the Iroquois. If it wasn't for the Anishinaabe, I argue, the French would have been probably wiped out much earlier than they were kicked out of the North American continent.
In Masters of Empire, Mike seeks to explore the long history of the Anishinaabe peoples in a way that moves them from the edges of European and American histories and places them at the center of the story with their European and American counterparts. Mike, what do you mean when you say that the Anishinaabe peoples have been at the edges of European and American histories?
I mean, I think there's a couple of reasons for it. In some ways, I think it has a lot to do with the idea that the so-called winners write history, that historians have generally rushed to try and, kind of understand the settlement of the continent by Europeans, the founding of America, the creation of Canada, have kind of pushed Native peoples to the edges of that history, if you like. But I think as well, there are other issues as well. As you know, as your listeners know from other podcasts, historians love and they need sources to work. And traditionally, these have been primarily written sources. So we've often just followed the paper trail, if you like. But that really means viewing the history of early America from the shoulders or over the shoulders of Europeans and not Indians. Indians, of course, did not leave such an extensive paper trail. So we often see that world, or have seen that world, as early Europeans saw it, with Indians, if you like, on the horizon, distant, and Europeans at the center of their own history. And in those documents that Europeans left, Indians really are kind of a presence on the edges. They become kind of fleeting, ephemeral presence. They only act when Europeans actually see and hear them. And so we really, don't get a sense of who they were, where they were, their longer history. It's harder to get Native peoples at the center of a history because they didn't leave their own, traditional paper trail. And if you think of, even the imagery that we have from this period, the famous painting by Benjamin West of the death of General Wolfe, we kind of see Native peoples kind of on the edge of the image. And there's a famous painting that hangs in the Wisconsin Historical Society called Braddock's Defeat. And that shows Long Lad in the middle, dressed as a European, directing Indians who are sort of on the edges of that image and kind of accompanying. But it's the European Long Lad who's directing the focus of that story. So in some ways, I guess I was excited about Long Lad because I knew that he would get me a little bit closer, at least, to kind of putting Native peoples into the center of the story. But I didn't realize when I started how central those Native peoples would become.
In addition to paper trails, historians also follow and research something they call historiography. Mike, what is historiography?
It's a little bit confusing. I know my students often have trouble with this, even after a couple of years of studying history, even as much as we sort of try and reinforce it. It's a bit confusing because we sometimes use it to mean writing history, simply to write history. Sometimes we mean it as a term to denote like a body of historical literature. But I think as practicing historians, we most commonly use it to mean a kind of history writing. I think that's the easiest explanation for it. A history of history writing. We need to know the historiography of particular questions, really to avoid reinventing the wheel all the time. If we tackle a new problem, or we start looking at a new peoples or a new community or new settlement, we really need to know what's been written about that place or those peoples before, so that we don't simply just write the same history that someone else has written, 10 or 20 or even 100 years prior. We really need to know everything that has been, or ideally we want to know everything that's been written about those particular places or those particular people. So we need to understand how others have written about it. So really we can add something to that to contribute to a kind of growing body of knowledge. And I think that's really important to understand that we're really kind of in conversation with older histories in order to kind of add something new to enrich those older stories, to add to kind of a growing body of knowledge about those histories. We build on the historiography of particular questions, really to create a richer and more complex historiography and to advance the story of a particular place or particular peoples.
Mike, if historiography is a history of history writing, does that mean that all history books and articles are part of the historiography?
It's a complicated question, I think. I mean, look, I think the short story is that there are many different historiographies. It really depends on the kind of question that you're asking, the kind of thing that you're looking to find out. So, there's a historiography on how people have used garden tools or agricultural implements over time. There's a historiography on the founding of America and, how we interpret the American Revolution. And so I think there's many different historiographies. And if we're looking to understand anything, we really need to kind of sort of triangulate those different historiographies.
Could you provide us with an example of how historians use historiography when they write history books and articles? Perhaps you could tell us about the Anishinaabe kinship networks that you explore in Masters of Empire.
It's a good question. Let me give you, I guess, the main example for how I got to writing about kinship and the Anishinaabe people. Before the 1980s or so, I think, we didn't really know a lot about the Great Lakes, and particularly Native peoples in the Great Lakes. At least historians, colonial American historians, didn't. And much of the history, I think, the Native American history that had been written, for example, in the 1970s, was really about Indians as victims, as people who were overrun and killed, massacred by Europeans. Now, in the 1980s and into the 1990s, colonial American historians began to kind of complicate that picture. And there was a really important book by Richard White called The Middle Ground, which opened my eyes and the eyes of many, I think, especially to the Great Lakes. He used French sources and really suddenly made us realize that there was a huge amount going on between Native peoples, French peoples, European peoples, British peoples in the Great Lakes. So when I started exploring the story of Long Lad, I turned to Richard White's book and used it a great deal. But I realized as I went along that he doesn't say a lot specifically about the Odawa, the people that I end up putting at the center of the story who lived up in the Michilimackinac or Mackinac region, or even the Anishinaabe. In fact, I don't think he used the term Anishinaabe because it really wasn't that current. Historians hadn't really kind of understood that term at that point in the 1990s. So as I began to piece this story together, even though Richard White's book was really important for opening up the door, if you like, I had to turn to other historians and more recent historians. Michael Witkin, for example, was exploring the history of the Western Ojibwe for about the same period. Heidi Bohaker at the University of Toronto was exploring the idea of Dodamog and this idea of kinship and how peoples were connected across the Great Lakes. James McClurkin had done some great work on the Odawa, but in the 19th and 20th centuries. So no one had actually written about the Odawa specifically from Michilimackinac in the 17th and 18th centuries, but by using these other histories and the histories of different places, but also histories of different processes, like Heidi's work on Dodamog, I could begin to piece together a better picture of the Odawa in the 17th and 18th century. And while I was doing that, others like Andrew Sturtevant, Brett Rushforth, Karen Marrero, all of whom worked on Detroit and Algonquian peoples, and were really doing some amazing work on different aspects of Anishinaabe history. I was able to use their work to kind of also to piece together the story of the Odawa. Other scholars, I've looked at their histories of gender, of kinship relations, and it's really by kind of putting together these different histories of different places, different peoples, and trying to kind of understand what those histories tell me about the Odawa specifically. That's how we can kind of move the conversation forward, move the discussion forward about different places, especially when we don't, as I said, have a lot of written sources from that particular place, Michilimackinac, in the 17th and 18th centuries.
Earlier, you mentioned the notion that history is written by the victors. And that's why many historians have seen Native Americans only over the shoulders of Europeans. Does this mean that historiography is a European or Euro-American concept? Do the Anishinaabe peoples have their own historiography?
In some ways, Anishinaabe historians have contributed to this discussion, of course, from the start. It's impossible to write this history without Anishinaabe historians. And they range. Interestingly, one of the great discoveries that I made, well, actually, I just drew on someone else's work again. This is what historians do. The work of Peter MacLeod up in Canada had written about three 19th century historians, Andrew Blackburn, William Warren, and Francis Sikenak. All of them, he realized, were Anishinaabe, and they all wrote histories of their people. Blackburn and Sikenak wrote about the Odawa, Warren wrote about the Ojibwe, but he looked at those 19th century histories and put together the patterns in them and realized that there was great similarities between the stories that they told and the histories that they wrote. And one of the things that they all emphasized was just how powerful the Anishinaabe people were and how little they viewed Europeans as a threat to them for much of the 17th and 18th and even into the 19th century. So those earlier Anishinaabe historians helped a great deal. Current academics, Native peoples who've become scholars, academics, have been essential and contributed to the kind of picture that historians have been able to build, but also, of course, the kinds of stories passed down from generation to generation. And people like, there's a fellow named Eric Hemingway of the Little Traverse Bay Band of Odawa up in Mackinac, who have done a huge amount to kind of figure this older story out and come up with some really amazing insights, like about Long Lad and even about the term Anishinaabe. You know, that term itself is a kind of a contemporary term that Anishinaabe peoples themselves have known about for many, many years and are educating historians, if you like, about how this might have worked in the past. So I think Anishinaabe historians have contributed to this, and I think that historiography has to include Anishinaabe perspectives.
In the first episode of Doing History, we spoke with Simon Newman about how average poor and enslaved early American men and women lived their day-to-day lives. In the second episode, we spoke with Jennifer Morgan about the experiences of enslaved African and African American women. From our discussions with these historians, and now with you, we see that there's a trend in our present-day historiographies to tell the stories of peoples who have not traditionally had a voice of their own within them. Do you know when this trend started and why?
I think in some ways the interest in people that didn't have a voice, subaltern people, if you like, that interest has been around a long time, I think. I'm just working on an African-American historian in the 19th century called William Cooper Nell. And I realized, he was doing his research in the 1840s, and he was really interested in just finding out as much as he could about Black patriots in the American Revolution, and was doing an extraordinary job of trying to kind of cobble together oral histories and testimony from survivors about African Americans in the Revolution who didn't leave any records of their own. So that was in the 1840s. But in a formal academic sense, I think, most historians, would date this kind of interest in people without a voice of their own to about the 1960s or so, and an explosion of history on what we call the new social history that really reflected a kind of a dissatisfaction with the focus on politics and great men that had prevailed in the historical profession up to that point. It, of course, reflected social changes, but also, I think, really importantly, the expansion of higher education after the Second World War. So many more women came into higher education, African Americans, Native Americans, and they were getting to university and reading formal history books and asking, where's my history? Where do the history of my people fit in? How do women fit into these stories? And I think many of them just simply said, look, enough is enough. I'm going to try and piece together the story that interests me, if you like. And I think we have now a much richer and much fuller idea of the past. But we're always discovering more because, of course, in some ways, the kinds of questions that we ask are really informed by the present. And as we know, the present is a big world and an expanding world as well.
That's a good point. No matter how objective historians try to be, as you noted, the present influences the way we view and interpret the past. Mike, how does the present influence the creation and evolution of historiography?
Yeah, I think it's always a clear and direct relationship. And I think in some ways, going back to one of the earlier questions that you asked about Native American scholars as well, and in Native American historiography, one of the books that I love to use for undergraduate teaching, even for graduate teaching, to start a kind of a discussion about what is history, is a book by M. Scott Momaday called The Way to Rainy Mountain. And it's a wonderful book about the Kiowa peoples. And in his preface, he sort of talks about the fact that really history is a turning and returning of myth, history, and memoir. Myth, history, and memoir. And I challenge my students to think about how we write history, because we sort of think maybe that doesn't sound like history. And Momaday, in fact, kind of just juxtaposes snippets of historical or archaeological evidence about the Kiowa people and his personal reminiscences, and also stories told by his grandparents or his ancestors that have kind of come down to him. And I actually think that's not quite so different from what we do today. We kind of have a bundle of myths that we grew up with, and this might be controversial, but, it's sort of a Judeo-Christian tradition in my case, for example, that makes me the person that I am. And we bring to the table our own history and our own perspective on that history, which is the memoir bit. And then we really try to put together a history, based on sources, traditional sources, non-traditional sources, the kind of the history archaeological part of this. So I actually do think that as the present changes, as we change, that's really an important part of how we think about history, the kinds of questions we ask about history. And it also allows us to see the past in a different kind of light and in a different way than someone that might have been born 40 years ago, Ohio, is going to read history and think about history and ask questions about history in a very different way than a student of mine here in Sydney who was born, in Sydney and raised here and is going to think very differently about that history. So I think the changes in social relations that we just discussed in the previous question of politics, in the case of the historiography of early America and Native peoples in it, I think those changes led to a history of Native Americans. But as I said, in many ways, those early histories written in the 1960s were about the kind of injustices that were perpetrated against Native peoples. And so a lot of the histories were written really about kind of atrocities in the past, battles in the past, massacres in the past, and portrayed Indians as victims. More recently, I think we've come to see Indians as really important players now, especially in the colonial period. We've realized that there are these pretty powerful groups of Native peoples. And we also realized that things like kinship and family played a hugely important role, not just formal politics. We understand how kinship and family kind of structured responses to different events and to Europeans. And so that's, again, we wouldn't have thought much about how kinship and family played a role in, say, bringing warriors to a battlefield 40 years ago. But because we have a better understanding of those terms and those processes in the history now, we can put them together a little bit better. And I think the other thing that's happened as well is that Native American scholars have brought a lot to the table and helped non-Native peoples understand that history. And there's been a shift to thinking about American history more generally, the kind of the bigger question, a bit differently, more continentally. A lot of new work has been trying to kind of think about the North American continent, not from the perspective of the Eastern Seaboard and Europeans' arrival and their movement westward, but to think about the North American continent as a whole and to think about where the center might be, or at least see multiple centers. And I think that's, again, a kind of a more recent development that also reflects present interests and concerns as we kind of think less about national borders. We think more about history across borders, what historians often call transnational history. So I think Native American history and this kind of continental history has come together to kind of make us rethink the history of North America as a whole. We're getting away from the idea of the centrality of the nation and thinking about different kinds of political and social formations across North America.
Our discussion has revealed that historians collaborate with each other by reading and adding to the historiography. But do historians collaborate and engage with the history of history writing in ways other than just reading and thinking about that writing?
We do it at conferences, we get together at conferences, at workshops, and I think social media and email have also made it much, much easier to collaborate in person. I was going through my old boxes that my mum had saved in Canada a year ago and finding letters that I'd written to professors in the United States and the letters that they had written back. And I think, gosh, what a different world it was. That might date me a little bit. But that was as late as the 1990s. We were still writing letters and it took considerable effort and considerable time to write those letters. These days, I can find anyone just about in a matter of seconds and really contact just about anybody in a few minutes. And so that's made it much easier, I think, to collaborate today. But as you mentioned, I think the main collaboration comes through our books and our articles. It's really always a process of learning from each other, testing hypotheses from one context in another, and sharing results. I think it's very much like what scientists do. But all of it is really about advancing a conversation. We build on what others have said. We try to bring it together. We maybe say something new or try to say something new about a particular story. And I was a newcomer to this field, so I had to have a lot of conversations with a lot of different people, and I'm still having those conversations. I hope that I've learned something, and I'm really enjoying the kind of response to the book because I'm getting emails from all kinds of different people, from Native peoples among the Lakota, people up in northern Michigan, who are still willing to talk and to have a conversation about what I've written and helping me to understand it even now after the book is published a little bit better as well.
You mentioned that historians are like scientists, and we know that scientists like to conduct experiments and that sometimes those experiments yield conflicting results. Do historians ever get conflicting results? Do they ever debate the historiography? And if so, how do those debates shape what we know about the past?
Yeah, look, I think it does happen all the time. The listeners will probably be aware of the controversy over Gordon Wood's Radicalism of the American Revolution. Gordon Wood published a book, I think it was about 1991, called The Radicalism of the American Revolution, where he really kind of stole the thunder of the new social historians by saying, well, actually, what was radical about it was not that Native peoples were affected or that the lower class rose up or that African Americans were advantaged or disadvantaged during the revolution. He simply said, look, it was radical because Americans got rid of a monarchy, established a republic, and ended up eventually creating a democracy. The publication of that book was very controversial at the time, and historians, I think, rightly criticized it for really ignoring a lot of the scholarship on different kinds of people in the American Revolution and the kinds of events and the kinds of contributions other groups made, and also was perhaps just a bit too sanguine about the kind of changes that took place in the American Revolution. And Wood's view was really that, look, it was enough to kind of create a feeling of equality. And it's a bit anachronistic to say that they should have actually created a kind of a sense of equality or worked to create equality in America. But that feeling of equality was really important and has unfolded over the last 200 years. Well, historians have known for a long time that, look, 18th century Americans, from Thomas Jefferson down to an enslaved Virginian, all knew what equality meant and all knew something like slavery was really wrong. We can't just dismiss it as anachronistic to think that it was possible to end slavery. Many people thought that it was possible. Jefferson thought it was possible, but whether people had a will to do it or not was really the important question. Now, since then, Gordon Wood has also dismissed a lot of the scholarship that doesn't put the story of the founding of America front and center of any story. And again, I think he's stirring up a lot of controversy from historians who say, look, we really need to kind of start thinking very differently. Why are we still trying to recenter the American Revolution? There were so many other things that were happening. The American Revolution is clearly important, but there were so many other things happening that help us in the end, I think, as well, to understand the American Revolution much better as well. And I think those kind of sharper debates, more controversial debates, have kind of dominated our idea of historiography and the way that we advance scholarship, because I really do think we advance debate more by collaborating, by conversing with each other, by having conversations, by building on each other's work, by thinking about how we each contribute a little bit of the story, another story to understand better, either a larger story or just simply getting a better picture of a particular place or a particular time.
It sounds like historiographical debates allow historians to consider certain ideas, decide whether they agree with those ideas, and if they don't, to try and prove that the evidence contained in historical sources say something different about the past.
No, definitely. And I think it's often a mistake to start doing history thinking I'm going to overturn everything we know about a particular place or a particular time. I think it's a bit hubristic, and I think there's a lot of good scholarship, old and new. A lot of stuff I draw from was written in the 19th century. It tells us something. It gives us a little bit more. It contributes a bit more to the picture that we're trying to draw. And I think it's really important to take those older works, whether they're in the 19th century, the 20th century, or they've been published yesterday, and to really engage with them and to think about how they affect the world that we're looking at and to try and think about how they help us to understand it better. I think it's really dangerous to simply just ignore it and plow on ahead with your own work, because you'll just end up often saying something that we've already figured out before or we already know.
Before we move into the time warp, would you tell us how having a historiography that seeks to understand Indian country on its own terms will better help us understand the early American past?
Look, I think it is really important to write Native American history, to understand Native American history. But I also think it's important to understand that Native American history in dialogue or with other histories. I think we need to think about the North American continent really as a huge mosaic of different peoples, both in the past and in the present. But in the past, we know that there's a huge diversity of native peoples. There's a long history of European, Spanish intervention, French presence on the continent. And we need to have a really good understanding of each of those different kinds of peoples, different communities, different groupings, to understand the whole and how it worked together. I think the best way to think about it is it really would be like trying to understand, for example, British-American relations in the 20th century without knowing anything about Britain or its relations with other countries, with European countries, with East Asian countries. I don't think we would even try. We wouldn't dare to do it. And yet we sometimes write about the history of Native American and American relations without knowing a lot about the native peoples who Americans were interacting with. So I think we need to understand so many different histories of different peoples in order to understand how they came together, how they interacted, why they fought at times, why they intermarried at other times. And I think it really also, in the end, enriches our shared history. Suddenly, for example, important sort of world events like the 7 Years' War or the American Revolution, we really can understand better how they happened and what kind of influences from native country, if you like, really helped trigger some of these events and how native peoples shaped these events. Now, sometimes they didn't work out in the favor of native peoples, but I think it's still important to kind of capture that history. And again, I would also say that a couple of reviewers of the book have sort of said, well, but McDonald doesn't talk about how native peoples, the Anishinaabe, kind of lost, if you like, or, he doesn't take the story up to when they lost that powerful place in the Great Lakes that they had. But they held that place for many, many centuries before Europeans came, and they held that place for 250 years after Europeans came. That's a long history that really can't and shouldn't be dismissed. That's a long history that we really need to think about how it affected other histories. They occupied an incredibly important place in the North American continent, the heart of the continent, the Great Lakes, the major highway into the continent. And they really occupied it at a time that was crucial in the making of the modern world. And so I think if we dismiss this history, if we ignore that native past, then we really, I think, have a very impoverished sense of the 17th and 18th century and how it created the world that we now live in.
Let's move into the time warp. This is the fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
In your opinion, what might have happened if the French and English had better understood Anishinaabe history and customs during the 17th and 18th centuries? How would the history of early America be different?
In some ways, I think if Europeans knew what they were dealing with from the start, I think that they might have been actually more worried about the Anishinaabe than they already were. And later, the Anishinaabe may have been targeted by different European groups more to try and to manipulate, to try and get in amongst and to try and put pressure on them, as they did with the kind of the more well-known groups like the Cherokee and the Iroquois. I think in some ways, because Europeans, didn't understand Anishinaabe political and social relations, they really didn't see them as a threat until it was too late, if you like. And so they didn't really target them. And particularly later when the Americans moved in, there wasn't as much pressure to either exterminate, to war with the Anishinaabe, or to remove them. In part, this was a factor of geography. But I think it was also that, they didn't look like other powerful groups like the Cherokee or the Iroquois. And so Americans didn't really have the same sense that they needed to kind of remove this threat and to take their lands from them as they did with other groups. But I actually, in thinking about that question, I also, it was reminded me of the counterfactual argument that historian James Axtell wrote about some time ago now, which is what would have happened if there were no Anishinaabe? He asked, what would colonial history look like if there were no Indians? Well, if we think about the Anishinaabe and their place in the Great Lakes, in a very difficult place to move and to survive, if you like, I think we would have seen very little westward exploration because very few people would have sort of had the resources and ability to travel far west without Indian help. We would have seen very little trade Indians were the ones doing the fur trapping that French people and English people traded. And so there would have been very few furs that were extracted from the Great Lakes. And there would have been very little reason for the French, for example, to stick around in the St. Lawrence Valley. And quite apart from the fact that I think they probably would have been overrun by the Iroquois if the Anishinaabe hadn't been around. I think just the simple fact that the French were so dependent on the Anishinaabe for so many different reasons that they probably wouldn't have stuck around in the St. Lawrence Valley in the 17th century is quite a powerful idea, because that would have really changed the history of the continent quite dramatically. And I would argue, at least, certainly we might not have had an American Revolution as a result.
During our conversation, you mentioned that you were looking at the role Black patriots played during the American Revolution. Is this the topic of your next project?
Well, I've got actually two projects on the go, and one of them is actually follows on from the history of the Anishinaabe. It's a comparative history of Indigenous peoples across the British Empire in the Age of Revolution, and I'm doing that with a colleague here in Sydney, Kate Fulliger, who's written a wonderful book called The Savage Visit. And that's one of the real benefits of working in a place like Australia, is you meet these great people who are working on really different topics in different contexts, but we're actually trying to think across the British Empire and think about how Indigenous peoples responded to new British imperial measures in the Age of Revolution. It's been a really fun and interesting project. So that's one project. But the other one, as you say, is one that I'm working on with Claire Cabal, who's also here in Australia and is a scholar of African Americans in the Harlem Renaissance. And we're really trying to look at the kind of uneasy relationship that African Americans had and in some ways continue to have with the Revolution and the history of the American Revolution, and the ways that African Americans kind of invoked the American Revolution to advance their rights, or also looked to other revolutionary traditions, Haiti, for example, to kind of advance their political projects. And so it's really a long history of how different generations of African Americans have remembered the American Revolution.
Where should we look for information about how we can contact you if we still have questions about the Anishinaabe or the history of history writing?
Probably the University of Sydney website is probably the best way to get my contact information. And yes, please feel free to email or get in touch by Twitter.
Michael McDonnell, thank you for taking us through some of the history of history writing and how historians use it to discover more about the past.
Thank you very much, Liz, for having me on the show. It's been great.
Historians study the history of history writing so they can add to what we know about the past. As Mike noted, they don't want to reinvent the wheel every time they research and write something about the past. What they want to do is expand our knowledge of history so we can better understand how it has impacted and shaped our present-day world. To this end, historians read and think about the ideas of other historians a lot. Sometimes this reading and thinking leads historians to add to what we know about the past by expanding upon the ideas of others. And other times, it leads them to create new ideas that challenge older ideas. History is the study of past peoples, places, and events. It offers us both facts about the past and a process to find and interpret those facts. Part of the process of historical interpretation includes debate. Although debates can be adversarial, more often they're collaborative. And this collaboration compels historians to think critically about the facts we know and what we think happened based upon those facts. It's this process of history that leads historians to know what they know about the past and to further our knowledge of it. You can find information about Mike, his book Masters of Empire, plus notes for the book titles and topics mentioned today on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/088. The Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture not only sponsors our behind-the-scenes look at how historians work, they also sponsor the work of early American historians. Their fellowships make it possible for historians to find and spend time with historical sources and to write about what they find. If you're a historian who would like more information about the types of fellowships the OI offers, or if you're a history lover who would like to learn more about how you can help support historical research, visit benfranklinsworld.com/OI. And while you're visiting the Omohundro Institute website, you'll see a link for the Doing History series right at the very top of the homepage. Click it, and you'll find a complete listing of all our Doing History episodes. Now, have you ever read a history book that made you rethink what you know about the past? If so, let me know which book you read and how it changed your thinking. Email your answers to liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me @LizCovart, or post a comment on the show notes page for this episode or in our listener community on Facebook.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.